hardly believe that we are sitting here kind of in the middle of April. I really don't know where the time has come this year. But it wasn't really too long ago when we were celebrating Epiphany. And the idea of Epiphany that we talked about at the time is it reminds us of how we can have sudden insights as the Magi did around the nature of God. And those can come to us at any time, in any experience we have. We can have an insight into God. But what's happening here in the story of the Acts of the Apostles about Paul is something even deeper and much more personally transformative. Different from an insight into the nature of God, this is a personal transformation that's extremely powerful. The person, Saul, who enters into this encounter is not the same person by the time it's over. Now, back in 1906, a French anthropologist, who was Arnold van Gennep, had been working with several different tribal peoples in different countries. And he was recognizing something in common that he wrote in a book that he called Rites de Passage, Rites of Passage. And in Rites of Passage, common to these cultures, he said, there is this instituted ritual that transforms a person from one status in society to another, or one way of being understood and thought about in their identity to another. Rites of passage, he said, are very different from other kinds of rituals. Rites of passage change people fundamentally in their self-understanding and in their understanding in the culture or society where they live. And everyone knows it. Now that idea was developed even further by another anthropologist in the 1960s named Victor Turner. Victor Turner took this idea from Van Gennep around what's going on in these rites of transformation, these rites of passage. And Turner developed even more this idea of three states of being that kind of characterize a rite of passage. In the beginning, a person has to be separated from the group identity that they had in a very dramatic fashion. And then they're put into an opportunity where their identity is dissolved. The world kind of goes upside down. It's a confusing place. It's a dangerous place. It's a vulnerable place. And Turner called it a liminal state. Liminality being translated to mean threshold. The threshold entry to a new way. And doorways are frightening places. If the door is closed and you're not quite sure what you're about to walk into. A threshold experience. When you're done with that liminal space, you come out the other side of it, reintegrated into society, says Turner, into a whole new understanding and a whole new identity. But it's this place of liminality that is so dangerous and requires such a depth of personal vulnerability that it requires a wisdom figure to keep you safe while you're in it and to help you as you transform. These wisdom figures in different societies can look like medicine people or shamans, but in the case of Paul, it's a guy named Ananias. Ananias translates to mean of Jehovah. So a man of God who is a practitioner of the emerging tradition that at the time is known as the Way. Now we remember again that for many of the first initiates into the teachings of Jesus, many of them were Hebrew people. And for them, this idea of recognizing the Messiah becomes right up against the majority of people who don't believe that the Messiah has come yet. And that's where a guy named Saul squarely sits. Now, in the Acts of the Apostles, where we've been introduced to Saul, I love how we hear about him. He kind of comes with Saul, who still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. Still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found anyone who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Okay. So he has a pretty good agenda. He's very clear. He's quite literally gung-ho against people of the way. Now, we actually get introduced to him a little bit earlier in the Acts of the Apostles. If we go just a couple chapters back into chapter 7, we find out how Saul is being formed as a young man. And here we have the occasion in which Stephen, who is a practitioner of the way, is basically accused and tried of blasphemy. Now, for the Sanhedrin, blasphemy is a capital offense. And the way that a blasphemer is put to death is by stoning. So Stephen is about to be stoned to death for blasphemy against the understanding of God and Hebrew tradition. So here's the description. They dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. And the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. And while they were stoning Stephen, he prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit," said Stephen. And then he knelt down and cried out in a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he had said this, he died. And Saul approved of their killing him. So even as a young man, as a young Hebrew male, this is a formative experience for Saul. It is a hate crime. It is a revenge against someone with a different idea. In anthropology, a heterodox idea that directly conflicts with the orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy, in no uncertain terms, is very clear about how challengers to the orthodoxy will be dealt with. And Saul is there seeing this, and he is formed by that violence. And in fact, in his career, in the quality of Hebrew male that he is, it's obvious that he becomes a very, very good practitioner. And that he represents that facet of priesthood which is specifically responsible for making sure people uphold the law. Because the law, in that tradition, is the social contract that the community has with God. It is paramount to uphold the law, and violators will be prosecuted and put to death. So he is, in his way, upholding a faith. And yet, the way he is expressing it is so vehemently violent that it shapes him. He is a man of anger, a man of violence, intentionally seeking out people to kill. This is the journey he's on to Damascus, with writ warrants for arresting members of the way in Damascus, so that he can drag them back to Jerusalem and have them stoned to death. And it's on this journey that something amazing happens to him. We're not exactly sure exactly what's going on, but we know that something very powerful happened in his journey. Powerful enough that it separated him from an understanding of the old way of being and his old beliefs and his old identity, and made him vulnerable when we hear that he is quite literally so ill that he is blinded. There is no greater vulnerability. Here he is traveling in a strange place. He may not know anyone, and is completely dependent on whoever can take him in this completely vulnerable state. And yet he is taken into someone's home. And at the same time, we hear the story of Ananias, who, as a practitioner of the way, no doubt knows about this man named Saul as a vicious prosecutor of people of the way. Why on earth would he want to go and meet this man? Furthermore, why would Saul, having been the vigilante he was, have any right to expect that a practitioner of the way would not just come to his presence, but take care of him in his woundedness and in his vulnerability, and take care of him in such a way that by that very engagement he is healed? Both men enter this relationship vulnerable and afraid, but both men called by God into that encounter. It's through that encounter, I believe, that Saul is healed. And then there is a way to think about that healing is much more than physical, but spiritually. The anger, the violence, that way of being is now no more. It is dissolved into this experience of being loved unconditionally and cared for, in spite of who he was. Now there's a little throwaway moment that we can easily overlook. It says, and he was better, and he got up, and he was baptized. That all happens in like this Mitch. He got better, he got up, he got baptized. That is that reintegration that Turner's talking about. Because in the Hebrew system of law, of which Saul was a proponent, you had to constantly ritually purify yourself again and again and again. Whenever you got contaminated by anything, and one of the ways you get contaminated was by an illness, which he had. So, rather than just simply doing one more mikvah, or ritual bath of purification to be in right relationship with God, this mikvah becomes baptism. And he no longer has to do any more practice of constant repurification. It's done. He is wholly and fully acceptable to God. He is baptized. And from that moment on, with the same fervor that he prosecuted, with the same lust that he saw the death of Stephen, in the memory of that, he moves forward through life from that point on as a believer in the way and a practitioner not of violence, but of love. Not of self-interest, but of the interest of others. And stays for a while to learn more. And in a way, takes the place of Stephen as an apostle himself. That kind of foundational transformation is exactly what we are invited into. We need to live into our baptismal covenant every day. And it doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes, we don't turn away from that way of being with one another. In that gospel reading, what does Jesus say? Here are these guys, he's called them twice. He gave them a commissioning while they were still alive. And he showed up and he still didn't get out of the room. And when they finally got out of the room, they were all hidden and fearful. What do? They're just going to go back to their own job. They go fishing. And with great patience and love, he shows up again. And he says, you're not doing it right. The traditional way was to fish off the left side of the boat. And this guy, they're not quite sure who he is, says, well, you're doing it wrong. Fish off the other side of the boat, the wrong side of the boat. Well, why not? You can catch any fish the right way. Let's try again. And they catch more than they could imagine. And then they realize. But the real realization is, you're doing it wrong. They're fishing for fish. You need to be doing what it asks you to do, which is being the experience of compassion and love and mercy and justice, bringing all people to a place of love and peace with one another. That's the way. Go out and do that way. And even if you get out there and you realize, oh, I messed it up, I got mad at that person, I let me have it. Or I didn't say the right thing, or I made a mistake. Or that thing I've been trying not to do, I did again. I'm not a horrible person. What does Jesus say? Get out there, get back in the boat, go out there and try again. Get back in the boat. Go out there and try again. That's the way. We must live into that recommissioning again and again and again and as many times a day until we, like Paul, are so transformed that we are loved and we are that commitment in Christ's name.